Welcome to week 5, lecture 3. So, a few years ago, I had the privilege of going to pastor a small rural church in rural Tennessee. And I'd come out of a town of about 160,000, a church of about 700 people, and I was on staff with about 10 other people. I went to a church of about, 200, 250 people by the time I left in a town of 2,000. With a staff much smaller than that. I think there was 3 of us at one point. And I was stepping into a brand new setting that, as a missional leader, I wanted to say, what could we as a church in a small community do to make a difference? But what I began to realize is that before I can think through and determine what the vision might be for who we are, I had to get to know the story of the people as they find themselves. So every community of faith has a certain set of stories or narratives that shape its existence in the world. Okay, and probably one of the things that pastors don't do well, because we're so eager to change things or make things new or make things different, is attend to the stories that already exist within the life of the church. This is the idea of appreciative inquiry. This is where we begin to unearth stories. Okay, and this book, Memories, Hopes, and Conversations. That's why I assigned this book, because this idea of appreciative inquiry is the ability to attend well to the stories of the community. We're going to talk a little bit about this in lectures 3, 4, and 5. There's also another great book that you might want to pick up at some point. It's called Discovering the Other, and this is a fantastic book that begins to look not only appreciative inquiry but asset-based management, where you begin to identify the assets within the local congregation that can bring change, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then also there's another book that I think you might find helpful, is Finding Our Story. I think all missional leadership is narrative leadership. It's attending to, curating, and helping to explore the possibilities of new stories. And so you've got to begin to help to understand what the story of the community of faith that you're serving is. And this only happens through relationship, as you begin to sit down and really begin to interview, either formally or informally, the people of the church, because there's a certain set of stories that they've embraced about themselves and their community. And when I say their community, the broader community that they find themselves, but also the church community. What is our story? And so some stories that churches have embraced or adopted are stories of scarcity. We don't have enough leaders. We don't have enough resources. We don't have enough time. Some stories that churches have embraced are stories of dysfunction. They'll point back to the number of times that things fell apart or broken, or the time that the pastor ran off with his secretary, or all of those broken stories that tend to create a sense of dysfunction within the boards or within the church leadership structures. Some people will tell stories of their glory days, right? About when we used to do things well. You'll hear people talk about their communities, and I think this is powerful. What is the way in which people understand their communities? If a church doesn't even like its community that it's in, or love its community at all, it's going to have a really difficult time reaching that community. And sometimes people, churches, especially churches that drive in, that aren't really like sort of enmeshed in the community, they don't really care for the community that they find themselves. In fact, they spend a lot of time trying to avoid it. But they'll talk about the community, sort of maybe the way in which the community has fallen apart, or the way in which the community has become broken. Or I remember the community when there was a lot of businesses and people were entrepreneurial, but now all of those businesses are boarded up and they're shut down, and there's a sense of poverty, and the streets aren't clean, and there's a sense of there's a sense of relational dysfunction due to gangs, or due to some of the social settings that they find themselves in. And so they talk about their communities in certain ways. And my question to you would be have you attended well, or sat down and listened well to the stories of the people that you serve, as they talk about themselves, their own place in the world, as they talk about the church congregation, how we've existed, how long have they been there, what do they know about the church, what is the overarching story of the church? Does the story of the church point to a past that they keep wanting to return to, that's no longer valid because the world around them has shifted? What's the story that they tell about their broader community? And what are the things that they deny, gloss over, don't want to talk about? Those places that are probably disruptive within the life of the organization or the congregation, but they don't know how to express or explore or discuss. Can you faithfully, in a shepherding sort of way, sort of coax those stories out and hold them out so that you understand that what is unconfessed often is left unchanged. Only as a church comes to terms with its story and the way it tells stories can change become possible. And then going back to the lax lecture, uh, how do I weave and wrap the stories that we tell about ourselves, our church, and our community into the broader biblical story? How do we have those stories collide so that in our preaching we're drawing upon what we know of our community, and we can sort of lay that out before them. So let me give you an example of what I did in my church in Erin, Tennessee. So when I got there, I found out that the men of the church had been cutting wood for free and giving it to homes where they couldn't afford to heat their homes via wood burning stoves. There was still a lot of that in the rural community that we found ourselves in. And I thought, man, that's an incredible missional contextual ministry. But they sort of, I mean, at some levels, there is a tendency or a temptation for any of us and all of us that once we've done something good to hang our hats on that, and then just to say, hey, we do missional things, we cut wood. And so what I did is I wrapped that story into a sermon in which I talked about 1 Thessalonians, where Paul says, hey, I don't need to talk to you about the way in which you love each other. You do so incredibly well, but I want you to do so more and more. And so what we began to talk about is absolutely everything you're doing, the difference you're making through the cutting of the wood, and you're giving that away free. It is incredibly important. It's essential, and it's a beautiful thing. But we've got to do so more and more, which opens the door to new expressions, fresh expressions of God's faithfulness. So, but I couldn't know that unless I sat time. I spent the first year that I was in that small church spending time with the elders of the church, the older adults in the church, hearing about the ways in which they talked about their church, their community, and curating those stories. What do I do with those stories as I seek to bring change or invite God's redemptive purposes within the life of that community of faith? And so in lecture one, we talked about how vision, DNA, values, behaviors, stories shape a congregation. In lecture two, we talked about the biblical story and how evocative use of the biblical story can begin to stir up within us a sense of discontent and a need for change. Identifying the kinds of stories that are already being told is so essential in helping people understand the potential and the possibilities of where we could go from here. This leads us to lecture 4, which we're going to talk specifically about the kinds of work we do with appreciative inquiry and why that becomes important.